A recent study published in Nature called Music Prevents Stress-Induced Depression and Anxiety-like Behavior in Mice attempted to study how music can be used as a therapy to prevent and reduce the effects of depression. And so these researchers studied the effects of music in a chronic, unpredictable, mild stress model of mice. And so what this model essentially means is that they attempted to increase stress levels in mice by changing their environment, by changing their feeding. And so they then did behavioral tests and biochemical tests, such as the polymerase chain reaction tests and immunofluorescence, and also the detection of oxidative markers. And so they did 4 different groups, one control group, one group which was exposed to all of these stressors, one group which listened to music, and one group that listened to music and was exposed to all of these stressors. So by dividing their sample in 4 different groups, they were able to see the effects of music on these different subsets. And so one of the first findings that these researchers found was through the tail suspension test, in which a mouse is suspended by its tail. And normally what mice try to do is to overcome that abnormal position. And what they found out was that in the group that was exposed to all of these stressors, they exhibited despair behavior, so they did not try to get out of that situation. But those mice that were exposed to music, and they were exposed to music for 1.5 hours between 8:30 and 10 p.m., those same mice that listened to music did not exhibit this despair behavior. One of the biochemical theses for depression is that reactive oxygen species play a role in the oxidative stress response. So these researchers also studied the levels of antioxidant enzymes in these different groups, and antioxidant enzymes play a role in mediating inflammation, so they have an important anti-inflammatory role. And what these researchers found out was that there were significant differences in the group which was exposed to music compared to the group which was exposed to stressors without the music. And so one of the enzymes which was measured was the superoxide dismutase, SOD, and they saw that there was an abnormality in the serum levels of these enzymes, essentially, for the group which was exposed to the stressor. But in the case of the group which was exposed to the stressor and was able to listen to music, the levels were essentially normal. They resembled that of the control groups. Inflammatory factors in the serum and brain tissues of these mice was also measured, mainly through the levels of interleukin-6 and interleukin-1 beta, which are inflammatory markers. And what they also found out was that the mice who were exposed to music reported lower levels of these inflammatory factors. And so this study also looked at how music could prevent neuronal death in the case of prolonged stress exposure. And so they did this by immunofluorescence through MAP2 to determine essentially the amount of neurons in the hippocampal region. As you may know, the hippocampus is a region associated to memory, and it is often, in the case of depression, there is a resultant atrophy to the hippocampal region. And so what they also observed in this study was that music was able to reduce the amount of neuronal death in mice that were exposed to stress but were able to listen to music. And so these mice, even though they were being exposed to these stressors, the exposure to music allowed them to have essentially a preservation of these neurons. They also studied this by looking at the DCX levels, which is a precursor protein present in newborn neurons. And they saw that in the dentate gyrus, which is a region of the hippocampus, the expression of this protein was significantly less for those mice which were exposed to the stressors without being able to listen to music, while in those that listened to music, their levels were essentially the same as in the control mice. They also looked at the levels of the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is an important mediator in neurogenesis, which is just a fancy name for the formation, the growth of neurons. And so what they also found out was that the BDNF levels were lower in those mice that were exposed to stress, while those that listened to music and were exposed to stress resembled that of the control group. And so essentially what this study shows is that music may play a role in preventing depression and even reducing the impact that depression has on our brain. But even then, we need to take in consideration that this is an animal study and that in humans there will most likely be some differences. Of course, we know that just by personal experience, that music has the potential to change our mood. It can make us feel happier. It can also make us feel sad. And so there is this very powerful aspect to music that is very psychologically profound. From this study, and I believe most studies of using music were done using classical music. And one of the questions here is also whether the type of music, the frequency of music, and I will put a table of the songs used in this study, whether that makes a lot of difference or not. Another question could also be whether music can be more effective for certain types of depression. Of course, the severity of depression most likely plays a role in the efficacy of music. We can also ask the question whether this effect of music in terms of its ability to reduce inflammation could simply be the case of inducing, in some sense, a mindfulness or a distraction from the stressor. And so it could be the case that this is not actually that specific to music. So perhaps something that could be argued is that any activity that reduces stress would generate effects similar to this, because if you reduce stress, if you reduce the amount of cortisol, if you reduce the amount of inflammation, then perhaps you will just get the same outcome. And so that is also something that needs to be questioned, which is how specific is this effect to music. But overall, just try it out, listen to some classical music, and let me know whether you have some experience in using music as a way to boost your mental health. And let me know if you found this video to be useful.